Karen demanded I cut down my 30-year-old tree. She regretted it fast. Chapter 1: Roots of Conflict. The tree had been standing tall for nearly 3 decades, its wide branches stretching proudly over the yard, casting dappled shade across the homeowner's lawn. It wasn't just a tree. It was part of the home's character, a living monument that had been planted when the family first moved into the neighborhood. Its roots reached deep into the earth, anchoring not just soil but memories, backyard picnics, swings that once hung from its branches, even the tire rope where children once played. But not everyone saw beauty in the tree. For years, it had quietly done its job, offering shade in the summer, vibrant colors in the fall, and a place for birds to nest in spring. Yet, to one neighbor, it was nothing more than a nuisance. That neighbor was Karen. She lived 2 houses down, and in her mind, everything in the neighborhood needed to align with her personal definition of perfect. Karen's obsession with order and control wasn't new. She was the kind of neighbor who measured the length of people's grass, reported cracked driveways to the HOA, and complained endlessly about holiday decorations being too bright. But recently, she had found a new target, the 30-year-old tree that stood in full bloom, occasionally casting a shadow onto her yard in the late afternoon. Karen began making her disapproval known in subtle but pointed ways. At first, it was passive-aggressive comments about how the tree was blocking her sunlight. Then it escalated into whispers with the HOA president, private emails, and not-so-private glares whenever she passed by. It wasn't long before the homeowner received the first official notice from the HOA, claiming that the tree posed an obstruction and potential hazard. The homeowner was stunned. The tree had passed city inspections, it was healthy, and even a local arborist had confirmed it was in perfect condition. There was no disease, no rot, no risk of falling branches. But Karen didn't care about facts, she cared about control. And through the HOA, she had found her weapon of choice. The notice demanded that the homeowner either cut the tree down within 30 days or face daily fines. The justification was vague, citing community aesthetic and neighborly harmony. Yet, everyone knew where this order originated. Karen's voice was written all over it. Still, the homeowner wasn't ready to surrender a beloved tree so easily. The 30 years of growth, shade, and beauty couldn't be erased just because one neighbor wanted more sunlight on her patio. The notice went up on the fridge, a constant reminder of the fight that was brewing. As days passed, Karen's behavior grew bolder. She would stand on her porch at odd hours, arms crossed, staring at the tree as though sheer disapproval could make it vanish. She began making comments loud enough for other neighbors to hear, painting herself as the victim of reckless landscaping. But what Karen didn't realize was that her campaign of control had awakened something in the homeowner, a resolve to fight back not just with emotion, but with knowledge and law. The homeowner started researching local ordinances, digging into city code late into the night. To their surprise, there were strict protections in place for mature trees. In fact, many municipalities considered trees over 25 years old to be part of the city's protected canopy, meaning they couldn't be removed without explicit permits, inspections, and justification. Cutting one down without approval could lead to massive fines, thousands of dollars per violation. Suddenly, the battle lines became clearer. Karen wasn't just asking for the removal of a nuisance, she was demanding something illegal. The HOA, whether knowingly or blindly, was backing her. But with the law on their side, the homeowner realized they had more power than Karen imagined. The first HOA meeting came quickly after the notice was sent. Karen attended, of course, her voice loudest among the group, insisting that the tree had no place in the neighborhood and that it lowered property values. She pushed the board to enforce fines immediately, pressuring them with exaggerated claims of safety risks and blocked light. But while Karen shouted, the homeowner quietly prepared their rebuttal, documents in hand, ready to present what Karen least expected, the truth. This was no longer just about a tree. It was about principle. It was about standing up to unreasonable demands and exposing the cracks in an HOA that was too willing to bend to one person's whims. And so, as the meeting adjourned and Karen walked out with smug confidence, the homeowner knew something Karen didn't. The fight was only just beginning, and this time, the law was firmly on the side of the roots. The stage was set. Karen wanted a tree gone. But the homeowner was prepared to ensure that the only thing to fall would be Karen's misguided crusade. End of Chapter 1. Next, Chapter 2, The Escalation. Chapter 2, The Escalation. The days after the HOA meeting were tense. The neighborhood, usually quiet and uneventful, seemed charged with a new energy. Karen had left the meeting convinced she had won. She strutted down the street with that smug look on her face, whispering to neighbors about how the tree would finally be gone soon. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if the homeowner's voice didn't matter. But while Karen spread her version of the truth, the homeowner quietly fortified theirs. They spent hours gathering evidence, photos of the tree's health, inspection reports from certified arborists, and, most importantly, printed sections of the municipal code that protected mature trees. Each document was neatly organized, every piece of information ready to counter Karen's crusade. Still, Karen wasn't slowing down. She had begun leaving passive-aggressive notes in the homeowner's mailbox, claiming the tree dropped too many leaves and was dangerous to children playing nearby. She even went as far as taking pictures of the tree from multiple angles, forwarding them to the HOA board with long, dramatic emails. She framed herself as the victim, forced to live under constant shade, claiming her family's happiness was being ruined by the tree. The HOA board, perhaps exhausted by Karen's relentless complaints, began to lean toward her side. Another letter arrived, this one harsher than the first. It declared the homeowner in violation of community guidelines and threatened daily fines of $100 if the tree wasn't removed within 30 days. The homeowner read the letter twice, a mix of anger and disbelief growing with every word. It wasn't just about the tree anymore, it was about the HOA being manipulated by a single person's vendetta. The fines weren't just unfair, they were illegal. Cutting the tree down without a permit would mean breaking city law. Yet, the HOA acted as if their rules superseded the law itself. The homeowner knew it was time to act. They called the city's Department of Urban Forestry and explained the situation. Within days, an inspector arrived. He carefully examined the tree, running his hand over the bark, checking the roots, and looking up at the canopy. His conclusion was clear: the tree was healthy, stable, and fully protected under city ordinance. He even noted that removing it without authorization could lead to penalties in the tens of thousands of dollars. The homeowner kept that report close, knowing it was their shield against Karen's obsession. But instead of confronting her directly, they let her dig herself deeper. Meanwhile, Karen was escalating her campaign. She began gathering signatures for a petition, knocking on doors and insisting that the tree was an eyesore. Some neighbors signed out of fear of her temper. Others signed just to make her go away. But not everyone was convinced. Many residents quietly admired the tree, grateful for the shade it brought to the street. They whispered their support to the homeowner, though few dared to stand up to Karen directly. It wasn't long before the homeowner noticed something strange. Small orange ribbons appeared tied to the tree's branches. At first, they thought it was some kind of prank. But then they realized the truth: Karen had marked the tree, preparing for what she thought would be its removal. She was moving faster, pushing the HOA to schedule a contractor without even consulting the homeowner. The tension reached a boiling point when the homeowner spotted a landscaping truck parked on the street one morning. The men unloaded chainsaws and equipment, looking up at the tree as though it was their next job. Panic surged, but before they could even approach, the homeowner showed them the city's inspection report. The workers froze, clearly uncomfortable. They explained that they'd been told by the HOA to prepare for removal, but without permits, they couldn't legally proceed. They packed up and drove off, leaving Karen fuming on her porch, shouting about non-compliance and neighborhood harmony. That was the moment the homeowner realized how far Karen was willing to go. She wasn't just trying to enforce HOA rules, she was trying to bully the entire system into bending to her will. And the board, caught in her web of constant pressure, was enabling her. But Karen's overreach had created an opportunity. By ordering work without permits, the HOA had exposed themselves to potential legal trouble. The homeowner documented everything: the letters, the emails, the attempted removal. Each piece of evidence was stacked neatly in a folder, building a case that was becoming stronger by the day. And then came the next HOA meeting. This time, the atmosphere was charged. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, murmuring as Karen once again launched into her tirade. She spoke loudly about uncooperative homeowners, community safety, and blocked sunlight. She waved her petition as if it were a weapon, insisting that the board take immediate action. But this time, the homeowner was ready. They stood before the board, calm and composed, and laid out the city ordinances, the inspection report, and the penalties for unauthorized tree removal. The room fell silent as the truth became undeniable: the tree was not just safe, it was legally protected. Removing it would cost the HOA, and possibly Karen, far more than they ever imagined. Karen's face twisted with rage as the board members shuffled uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered among themselves, realizing they had nearly led the HOA into a legal disaster. For the first time, Karen's power over the room seemed to falter. But the battle wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. As the meeting adjourned, she stormed out, her heels clacking against the floor, muttering that this wasn't finished. The homeowner knew she meant it. What Karen didn't realize, however, was that the fight she had started had now shifted against her. The homeowner wasn't just defending a tree anymore, they were preparing to hold the HOA accountable for every overstep, every unlawful demand, and every attempt to enforce rules that didn't exist. The war over the 30-year-old tree had escalated. And the next move was about to change everything. End of Chapter 2, next, Chapter 3, The Breaking Point. Chapter 3, The Breaking Point. The days following the heated HOA meeting were filled with tension thick enough to cut through. Karen's grip on the board had loosened, but not broken. She prowled the neighborhood like a restless hawk, glaring at the homeowner's property as though the tree itself was mocking her. Her anger wasn't just visible, it was contagious. She began whispering rumors, suggesting the homeowner was a troublemaker who thought they were above the rules. Some neighbors ignored her, some quietly sympathized, but others grew cautious. That was Karen's talent, turning doubt into fear, fear into compliance. And though her petition had been weakened by the homeowner's city-backed evidence, Karen wasn't finished. She was only recalibrating. One morning, the homeowner woke to find an anonymous note taped to their front door. The words were jagged, written in bold black marker: "Cut it down before someone gets hurt." The handwriting was sloppy, but the message was unmistakable: this wasn't about rules anymore. This was a threat. The homeowner snapped photos, filed the note into their growing folder of evidence, and doubled down on their documentation. They installed a small camera near the porch, its lens barely noticeable among the vines. If Karen, or anyone else, tried anything, there would be proof. But Karen had other plans. She wasn't going to wait for the HOA to make a move. She started staging small scenes to prove her point. She walked her dog deliberately under the tree, tugging its leash until it sat in the shade. Then she snapped pictures, sending them to the HOA with captions like, "Dangerous falling branches nearly hit us today." The absurdity was clear, but with enough repetition, she hoped the narrative would stick. The board, already embarrassed by their misstep with the landscaping crew, now faced a dilemma. They couldn't openly defy city ordinances, but they also didn't want Karen stirring chaos in every meeting. So, instead of siding with her directly, they began to pressure the homeowner indirectly. Letters arrived that didn't mention cutting the tree but instead raised vague concerns about landscaping upkeep. Small fines were tacked on for grass being slightly too tall or leaves left too long on the ground. It was obvious what they were doing, weaponizing technicalities to wear the homeowner down. For the homeowner, it was exhausting. Each envelope in the mailbox felt like a fresh attack, another reminder that Karen's obsession was dragging the entire HOA into open hostility. Nights were sleepless, filled with questions. What if they found another loophole? What if Karen pushed someone else to act on her behalf? And then came the night that proved just how far Karen was willing to go. It was around midnight when the homeowner's camera caught movement. A shadowy figure crept into the yard, flashlight in hand. The beam swept across the base of the tree, pausing as if searching for something. The figure crouched low, producing what looked like a small saw or blade. They began to scrape at the bark, deliberately damaging the trunk. The homeowner, watching from inside, grabbed their phone and dialed the police. By the time officers arrived, the figure had bolted, but not before the camera had captured enough detail, a distinct outline, a recognizable hairstyle, the way the intruder stormed off toward Karen's house. The police took the report seriously. Tampering with a protected tree wasn't just vandalism, it was a criminal act. The officer assured the homeowner that charges could be filed once the footage was processed. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Police cars had been seen outside Karen's home. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she'd been caught red-handed, others claimed it was all a misunderstanding. But the truth was clear to the homeowner: Karen had crossed a line she could never uncross. Yet Karen wasn't remorseful. If anything, she doubled down. She stood on her porch as if nothing had happened, loudly proclaiming that the homeowner had set her up. She told anyone who would listen that the tree was a menace and that she was only trying to protect the children. Her theatrics were dramatic, almost desperate, but the cracks in her influence were beginning to show. For the HOA, this was the breaking point. The board members could no longer deny that their alignment with Karen had created a liability. They weren't just risking fines, they were risking lawsuits. Quietly, they began reaching out to the homeowner, asking for mediation and mutual understanding. But for the homeowner, it was too late for compromise. The homeowner had everything they needed: city ordinances, inspection reports, threatening notes, vandalism footage, and now police involvement. What began as Karen's vendetta had spiraled into a case of harassment, property damage, and abuse of power. And the homeowner wasn't just going to defend themselves anymore, they were preparing to strike back. Karen, however, refused to see the storm gathering around her. She still believed she could twist the narrative, paint herself as the victim, and force the board to do her bidding. What she didn't realize was that her reckless obsession had finally turned the entire system against her. The tree still stood tall, its branches swaying in the wind as if mocking her attempts. But more than that, it now symbolized resistance, the refusal to be bullied, the resilience to stand firm against relentless pressure. The homeowner knew the next steps would determine everything. It wasn't just about protecting the tree anymore. It was about exposing the HOA's unlawful actions, holding Karen accountable, and ensuring that no one else in the neighborhood would ever face this kind of harassment again. As the homeowner closed their evidence folder one last time, they knew the battle was about to reach its peak. The HOA had pushed them to the edge. Karen had dragged them through months of torment. Now, it was time to fight back. And this fight was going to leave scars. End of Chapter 3. Next, Chapter 4, Turning the Tables. Chapter 4, Turning the Tables. The homeowner sat at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside them, as they sorted through the mountain of documents. Letters from the HOA, photos of the threatening note, screenshots of Karen's slanderous messages, and most importantly, the security footage of the attempted vandalism. Each piece told a story. Separately, they were nuisances. Together, they were devastating. It was no longer about just defending the tree. It was about dismantling the HOA's campaign of harassment once and for all. The homeowner had been patient, enduring fine after fine, insult after insult, but now patience was over. It was time to go on offense. The first step was simple: a visit to City Hall. Armed with their evidence folder, the homeowner scheduled a meeting with the city's code enforcement department. The officials were already familiar with Karen's antics. She had filed multiple complaints in the past about neighbors' fences, mailboxes, and even porch lights. But this time, the officials weren't just amused, they were concerned. The attempted vandalism of a protected tree was a serious offense. The homeowner handed over the footage, and the city promised swift investigation. Next came the HOA board. Instead of waiting for another meeting, the homeowner prepared a formal letter, one that cut through all the vague fines and arbitrary rules. It wasn't a plea or an apology. It was a notice. The homeowner outlined the harassment, cited city ordinances, and demanded immediate cessation of fines related to the property. More importantly, the letter warned that if the board continued to enable Karen's crusade, they would face legal consequences. The homeowner copied not just the board, but also the HOA's management company, the city attorney's office, and even local news outlets. When the board members opened their emails the next morning, they knew they were trapped. They could no longer hide behind their vague authority. Their actions were documented, their complicity clear. The balance of power had shifted. Karen, however, was blind to the change. She still strutted around the neighborhood, muttering loudly about how the homeowner was selfish and how the tree belonged to everyone, not just one person. But her confidence began to falter when she realized fewer and fewer neighbors were nodding along. Some even avoided her entirely, tired of being dragged into her endless war. The homeowner didn't stop at letters and city officials. They began sharing their story. Carefully, they posted online in local forums, describing the harassment without naming names. The responses were overwhelming. Other residents from different neighborhoods chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. The solidarity was energizing. What Karen had tried to make into an isolated battle was becoming part of a larger conversation, one that exposed the abusive side of homeowner associations everywhere. By now, the HOA board was panicking. They called an emergency meeting, not to attack the homeowner, but to discuss damage control. Their lawyer advised them that the best course of action was to drop all fines, issue a statement of compliance with city ordinances, and distance themselves from Karen's behavior. It was the only way to avoid lawsuits. But Karen didn't take the news well. When she learned that the board was backing down, she exploded. She accused them of cowardice, of failing to protect the neighborhood. She screamed that the tree was a symbol of favoritism and insisted that the board was being manipulated. Her tirade only further alienated her from the few allies she had left. Meanwhile, the city investigation was moving quickly. Officials confirmed that the tree was healthy, stable, and legally protected. Any attempt to cut it down, or even harm it, would result in steep fines not for the homeowner, but for the person responsible. And with the security footage clearly showing Karen sneaking into the yard with a saw, the officials had more than enough to act. Within weeks, Karen received her own letter. It wasn't from the HOA this time, but from the city. She was being fined for attempted vandalism of protected property, with the possibility of criminal charges if the homeowner pressed further. The irony was delicious. Karen, who had tried to fine her neighbor into submission, was now the one facing financial punishment. For the homeowner, it was vindication. But they didn't stop there. They knew Karen's power came not just from her own actions but from the HOA's willingness to enable her. So, they began working on something bigger, a petition to remove Karen from the board entirely. With the story spreading online and neighbors quietly turning against her, signatures came faster than expected. People were tired of her constant drama, her need to police every detail of their lives. The petition wasn't just about the tree, it was about reclaiming peace in the community. As word of the petition reached Karen, she grew increasingly unhinged. She paced her porch, shouting into her phone, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy. She threatened lawsuits, declared she would take this all the way to the top, but no one was listening anymore. Her reign of intimidation was collapsing under the weight of her own obsession. The homeowner, once the target of constant harassment, was now in control. The board was retreating. The city was on their side. The neighbors were beginning to rally. And Karen, for the first time in years, was powerless. The tables had turned. But the homeowner knew the fight wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. She would lash out, make one final desperate attempt to reclaim control. And when that happened, it would either be the end of the battle, or the moment the war truly began. As the sun set behind the tall branches of the 30-year-old tree, the homeowner looked out their window. feeling a rare sense of calm. The tree had stood through storms, through years of growth, through countless challenges. And now, it had become the symbol of their resilience too. Whatever came next, they were ready. End of Chapter 4. Next, Chapter 5, The Showdown. Chapter 5, The Showdown. The homeowner had expected resistance, but not silence. After weeks of threatening letters and constant harassment, the quiet from the HOA board was almost unnerving. Fines stopped arriving, emails went unanswered, and even the usual patrols of Karen stalking past the property had slowed. But silence rarely meant surrender. It meant plotting. And plotting was exactly what Karen was doing. On the surface, she seemed isolated. Neighbors avoided her, the board had begun distancing itself, and the petition to remove her was gaining signatures daily. But beneath that, Karen was scheming. She had spent years manipulating the HOA, and she wasn't going to let her power slip away without a fight. She began whispering to the few residents still willing to listen, spinning tales of corruption. She claimed the homeowner had bribed the city, that the petition was fraudulent, and that the tree itself was diseased, a danger that the city had supposedly ignored. These were lies, of course, but lies have a way of spreading. A small group of her loyalists showed up at the next HOA meeting, emboldened by her dramatics. They shouted about safety, demanded transparency, and accused the homeowner of being a neighborhood menace. For a moment, it seemed Karen's chaos might succeed. But this time, the homeowner was ready. Instead of staying quiet, they attended the meeting themselves. They didn't bring anger or emotional outbursts. They brought facts. Copies of the city's official inspection report, printed and highlighted. Still frames from the security footage of Karen with a saw, enlarged and placed neatly in a binder. Emails from neighbors expressing support, signed and dated. And finally, the petition itself, with dozens of signatures demanding Karen's removal from the board. The room shifted instantly. Karen's allies faltered, stammering excuses about miscommunication. The board members, visibly uncomfortable, couldn't deny the evidence staring back at them. For the first time, Karen's grip on the HOA was slipping not just socially, but structurally. Still, she refused to back down. She stood, red-faced and trembling, accusing the homeowner of staging the evidence, of editing the footage, of coercing signatures. She shouted until her voice cracked, pointing a shaking finger at the homeowner as though her rage alone could carry the argument. But the board was no longer listening. Neither were the neighbors. And then, the turning point arrived. Halfway through Karen's tirade, a city official quietly entered the room, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. They weren't there for the homeowner. They were there for her. The city had finished its investigation, and the attempted vandalism of a protected tree was no longer just a fine, it was now a case of criminal mischief. The silence in the room was absolute as the officers approached Karen. They explained, calmly and formally, that she was under investigation, that her actions had violated municipal law, and that she was being issued a summons. Karen sputtered, shrieked, and clutched at her chest as if betrayed. She screamed at the board, at the homeowner, at the entire neighborhood. She claimed she was the victim, that the system was corrupt, that everyone was conspiring against her. But her words carried no weight anymore. The evidence was undeniable. The law was clear. And her power was gone. As the officers escorted her out of the meeting room, the air seemed lighter. Neighbors exhaled in relief, some whispering to one another, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For years, Karen had wielded fear like a weapon, controlling the community through intimidation. And in a single moment, that weapon had been stripped from her hands. The board, clearly shaken, tried to regain composure. They moved quickly to address the petition, and without Karen there to defend herself, the vote was unanimous. Karen was officially removed from the board. Her reign was over. But the homeowner didn't stop there. With the momentum of the moment, they called for reforms. They demanded transparency in HOA finances, clear boundaries on enforcement powers, and protections against harassment. The neighbors, weary from years of tension, rallied behind the cause. The board, desperate to restore credibility, agreed. In that single evening, the entire balance of the neighborhood shifted. Karen's house, once the hub of gossip and control, now sat dark and silent. She withdrew from public life, too humiliated to face the community she had once ruled. Her whispers carried no weight, her allies abandoned her, and her threats were nothing but echoes of a power long gone. For the homeowner, it was more than victory. It was vindication. The tree still stood tall, branches swaying gently in the night breeze, as though defying Karen's years of spite. It had become more than just wood and leaves, it was a symbol of resilience, proof that patience, persistence, and courage could outlast even the most relentless campaign of harassment. The neighborhood, too, felt transformed. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now smiled, waved, and chatted. The fear of being fined for a mailbox color or a slightly overgrown lawn evaporated. The community began to feel like a community again. But in the quiet moments, the homeowner knew this wasn't just about one tree, or even one Karen. It was about standing up to unfairness, about knowing the rules better than those who try to abuse them, and about turning the very system of control back on itself. Karen had wanted the tree gone because it blocked her sunlight. Instead, it cast the longest shadow she had ever known, the shadow of her own downfall. And as the homeowner looked at it now, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, they knew the fight had been worth every sleepless night, every stressful letter, every confrontation. The showdown was over. But the story wasn't finished yet. There was still the aftermath, the consequences Karen would face, the changes the neighborhood would embrace, and the legacy of a tree that had stood not just against the wind and rain, but against tyranny itself. End of Chapter 5. Next, Chapter 6, Aftermath and Reckoning. Chapter 6, Aftermath and Reckoning. In the days that followed the dramatic HOA meeting, the neighborhood began to feel like a different place. For the first time in years, the air seemed lighter. People no longer averted their eyes or rushed indoors when they saw Karen lurking nearby. Instead, they lingered outside, exchanged smiles, and began rebuilding a sense of trust and community that had long been smothered under Karen's shadow. The tree, still standing tall and proud, had become a symbol of that change. Children played beneath it again, chasing each other around its massive trunk. Neighbors stopped by to admire it, as if the branches themselves carried the weight of their shared victory. It was no longer just the homeowner's tree, it was the neighborhood's tree, a living monument to resilience against tyranny. But while the community began to heal, Karen's reckoning was only beginning. The summons she received during the HOA meeting was just the start. The city pursued the case against her with surprising speed. Tampering with a protected tree carried steep consequences, and her attempt to vandalize it in secret was now backed by clear video evidence. Fines quickly escalated into thousands of dollars, and the damage to her reputation was irreversible. For someone who had once ruled the neighborhood with intimidation, it was humiliating. Once, she had wielded the HOA like a weapon. Now, she was stripped of her position, mocked quietly by neighbors, and viewed as a pariah. Invitations to community events stopped coming. Even those who had once sided with her found reasons to distance themselves. She was isolated in the very place she had tried to control. The homeowner, meanwhile, found themselves in an unusual role, that of an accidental leader. Neighbors began approaching them, asking advice, thanking them for standing up when no one else dared. Some shared their own stories. Of fines for garden decorations, of threats over lawn care, of letters demanding compliance for absurd reasons. For years, everyone had been too afraid to speak up. But after the showdown, they no longer felt powerless. The HOA itself began to change as well. With Karen gone, the remaining board members had no choice but to adopt new policies. Transparency became a priority. Financial records were shared openly, enforcement rules were clarified, and new elections were scheduled. What had once been a tool of control began to transform into a functioning system that actually served the community. For the homeowner, it was a quiet satisfaction. They had never wanted to be a crusader. They hadn't sought conflict or glory. All they had wanted was to protect a tree that had stood for decades, a tree that carried memories, shade, and beauty. Yet in defending it, they had done far more, they had reshaped their neighborhood. Still, the scars of the battle lingered. The stress of months of harassment wasn't erased overnight. There were moments when the homeowner still jumped at the sound of mail being delivered, half expecting another fine or threatening letter. There were nights when they lay awake, remembering the sight of Karen with a saw, remembering the fear that their tree might be gone in the morning. But healing came slowly, and it came surely. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the branches of the tree, the homeowner stood in their yard and reflected on it all. They thought about Karen's arrogance, her obsession with control, her endless need to dominate. They thought about the board's cowardice, how they had enabled her for so long. And they thought about the moment everything turned, the moment facts, persistence, and law had overpowered fear and manipulation. It hadn't been easy. It had been exhausting, draining, at times even terrifying. But in the end, justice had prevailed. Karen's life, meanwhile, unraveled further. Legal fees mounted, and whispers spread that she was considering selling her house. Whether it was the shame, the financial strain, or simply the fact that she no longer had control, no one knew. But her absence from community life was stark. Her windows remained shuttered, her yard untended, and the once constant stream of complaints and demands dried up completely. Some neighbors felt pity for her. Others felt nothing at all. But most agreed on one thing: she had brought it on herself. For the homeowner, the greatest victory wasn't Karen's downfall. It was the peace that followed. The quiet mornings spent sipping coffee under the shade of the tree. The laughter of children playing without fear of reprimand. The neighborly chats at mailboxes that no longer carried threats. Life felt normal again. Better than normal. Free. As seasons passed, the tree continued to stand strong. Its leaves turned gold in autumn, bare in winter, then lush green again in spring. It had witnessed the storm of conflict, and now it stood as a silent guardian of peace. Each time the homeowner looked at it, they felt a swell of pride, not just for saving it, but for what it represented. Karen had wanted the tree gone because it blocked her sunlight. Instead, it became the very thing that exposed her darkness. In the end, the homeowner learned something profound. Bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, crumble when faced with truth, patience, and courage. Systems, no matter how rigged, can be challenged. And even the smallest acts of defiance, like protecting a tree, can ripple outward to change an entire community. The battle was over. The reckoning complete. And as the tree's branches swayed gently in the wind, it seemed to whisper the story back to the neighborhood, a story of a homeowner who stood tall, a Karen who fell hard, and a community that found its strength again. The tree lived on. And so did the victory. White heavy checkmark. End of chapter 6, story complete.